In 1815, a single rumor spread across London, not through newspapers, not through government messengers, but through whispers. The rumor said that Napoleon had lost the Battle of Waterloo. But here's the strange part. Before the British government officially confirmed the news, before generals had even finished counting the dead, one man already knew the outcome, and that man was standing on the floor of the London Stock Exchange. His name was Nathan Mayer Rothschild. According to one of the most famous legends in financial history, what he did next allowed him to make a fortune so large that it helped cement the power of the most influential banking family in modern history. But here's the twist. The real story of the Rothschild family is far more fascinating than the myth, because this is not just a story about money. It's a story about information, strategy, power, and the birth of the modern financial system. And it all started in one of the poorest places in Europe. To understand the Rothschild dynasty, we need to go back to Frankfurt, Germany, in the year 1744. At the time, Jewish families in Frankfurt were forced to live in a narrow district called the Judengasse, or the Jewish Alley. It was overcrowded and restricted. Jewish residents could not own property outside the area. They couldn't leave after dark, and many professions were closed to them. But there was one trade that was allowed: money lending. At the time, many Christian laws discouraged charging interest on loans, but European economies still needed people who could manage money, loans, and currency exchange. So Jewish families filled that role. And inside this difficult environment, a boy named Mayer Amschel was born. His father worked as a coin dealer, trading currencies from different European states. Young Mayer learned quickly. He studied coins, he studied trade, and most importantly, he studied how money moves. But when he was still a teenager, tragedy struck. Both of his parents died from smallpox, and suddenly, Mayer was on his own. Mayer left Frankfurt for a while and went to work in a banking house in Hanover. There, he learned something that would shape his entire future. Money itself wasn't the real power. Relationships were. If you knew the right people, you could move money across borders, across governments, and across entire economies. When Mayer returned to Frankfurt, he started a small trading business dealing in rare coins and currency exchange. And he made a small, but symbolic change. He changed his surname. The house where his family lived had a red shield hanging above the door. In German, Rothschild means red shield. And from that moment on, Mayer Amschel became Mayer Amschel Rothschild, a name that would soon become one of the most powerful names in finance. Mayer understood something crucial. In banking, reputation is everything. So instead of trying to serve everyone, he focused on one extremely powerful client, a man named Prince Wilhelm IX of Hesse-Kassel. Wilhelm was one of the richest rulers in Europe. Much of his wealth came from renting out his soldiers to foreign governments, essentially running a mercenary army for hire. That meant he had enormous amounts of money moving across Europe, and he needed someone trustworthy to manage it. That person became Mayer Amschel Rothschild. This relationship changed everything. It gave the Rothschild family capital, credibility, and access to powerful political networks. But Mayer's greatest decision wasn't about money. It was about family strategy. Mayer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons, and instead of keeping them all in one place, he made a bold decision. He sent each son to a different financial capital in Europe. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Salomon went to Vienna. Nathan moved to London. Karl went to Naples, and James went to Paris. 5 brothers, 5 financial centers, 1 family network. This was revolutionary, because in the early 1800s, communication was painfully slow. There were no telephones, no telegraphs, and no internet. Messages traveled by horse and courier. But the Rothschild brothers created their own private courier network that moved information faster than almost any government system. They used coded letters, trusted only family members, and shared financial intelligence across Europe. This meant the Rothschilds could move money faster than armies could move soldiers. And in an era defined by constant war, that advantage was priceless. The early 19th century was dominated by conflict, especially the Napoleonic Wars. And wars are expensive. Governments rarely have enough money saved to pay for them, so they borrow. They issue government bonds, which are essentially loans from investors that will be repaid with interest. But issuing bonds across multiple countries requires trust. Investors need to believe the government will repay the loan, and governments need banks capable of distributing those bonds across international markets. The Rothschild network could do exactly that. They helped finance Britain's war effort against Napoleon. They transported huge shipments of gold across Europe, stabilized currencies, and began financing massive infrastructure projects like railways and canals. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild family had built one of the most powerful financial networks in the world. Some estimates suggest their fortune, adjusted for today's value, could equal $1 to $3 trillion. At their peak, the Rothschilds controlled more wealth than many of the governments they lent money to. Now, let's return to Nathan Mayer Rothschild and the famous story of Waterloo. According to legend, Nathan received news of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. When he arrived at the stock exchange, he appeared worried, and then he began selling British government bonds. Other traders saw this and panicked. They assumed Nathan had inside information that Britain had lost the battle, so they started selling too. Prices collapsed. Then, right before the market hit the bottom, Rothschild agents quietly bought huge quantities of those bonds. Soon after, the official news arrived. Britain had won. Bond prices exploded upward, and Nathan Rothschild allegedly made an enormous profit. It's a dramatic story, but historians believe the truth is more complicated. Nathan probably did receive early news of the victory, and he probably did profit from that information. But the theatrical market manipulation described in the legend was likely exaggerated or invented decades later. Still, the story reveals something important. The Rothschilds had an advantage that almost no one else possessed: information speed. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild family had become the most influential banking dynasty in Europe. But their power wasn't political. No one voted for them. Instead, their influence came from something more subtle. They controlled access to capital. When governments needed money, they often went to the Rothschilds. And when you control access to money, you gain leverage. The Rothschilds charged large commissions, negotiated favorable deals, and sometimes even refused to finance certain governments if they believed the risk was too high. In some cases, this meant entire countries struggled to access international capital markets. These decisions weren't democratic, they were financial, and they demonstrate an important truth about global finance. The institutions that move money can shape history just as much as the people who write laws. However, the Rothschild story also became entangled with something darker. Because the family was Jewish, their success made them a target for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. For nearly 2 centuries, extremists claimed the Rothschilds secretly controlled world governments. These accusations were used in propaganda, especially by the Nazis in the 20th century. The reality is much less dramatic, but far more complex. The Rothschilds didn't control the world. They were simply extraordinarily successful bankers who filled a gap in the financial system. But conspiracy theories turned them into symbols, representing everything people feared about wealth and power, and those myths caused real harm. No dynasty lasts forever. By the late 1800s, the financial world was changing. Central banks began gaining power, and new financial centers, especially New York, started dominating global markets. Industrial tycoons like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller built fortunes that rivaled the old European banking families. Then the 20th century brought two devastating world wars. The Rothschild houses in Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples eventually faded or closed. During World War II, Nazi forces seized many Rothschild assets in Europe. Family members fled to Britain and other countries. Some were captured, but most survived. After the war, the remaining branches continued operating, but with far less dominance. The Rothschild name still exists in global finance today. The London and Paris branches eventually merged into a modern investment bank known as Rothschild and Company. It is a respected financial advisory firm involved in mergers, acquisitions, and asset management. But it is no longer the unmatched financial empire it once was. Today's financial system is far larger and more complex. Global markets process trillions of dollars every day. Power is distributed among central banks, investment funds, multinational corporations, and government institutions. The Rothschilds are still wealthy, but they are no longer at the absolute center of the global financial system. So why does the Rothschild story still matter? Because it reveals something fundamental about how power works in finance. In the 1800s, financial infrastructure meant career networks, family relationships, and trust. The Rothschilds controlled that infrastructure. Today, the infrastructure looks different. It's digital systems, global investment funds, central banks, and credit rating agencies. But the underlying question remains the same. Who controls access to capital? Because whoever controls that access holds enormous influence over economies, governments, and societies. There's a famous quote often attributed to Mayer Amschel Rothschild: "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." The problem is, he probably never said it. Historians believe the quote was fabricated long after his death. But the reason people keep repeating it is revealing, because it captures a suspicion many people have always felt, that money and power are deeply connected. The Rothschild family didn't invent that relationship. They simply mastered it earlier than anyone else. And when their era ended, the system didn't disappear. It simply found new masters. Which raises a question that matters far more than the myths about one banking dynasty. A question most people rarely stop to ask. Who controls the infrastructure of money today? And if we don't know the answer, who does?